Welcome to an atmospheric village mystery. Follow Detective Sarah Chun as she investigates the death of a beloved librarian in the picturesque village of Millbrook. What starts as a simple case quickly unravels into a web of secrets spanning 60 years. A mysterious locket, a missing young woman from 1963, and corruption at the highest levels of village society. Can Sarah solve both mysteries before the killer strikes again? If you're enjoying this thrilling mystery, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more gripping crime stories. Let us know your theories below. Who do you think is behind these decades-old secrets? Share this with your friends if they love a good mystery too. The harvest moon hung like a silver coin against the velvet sky, casting long shadows across the cobblestone streets of Millbrook Village. Detective Sarah Chun pulled her coat tighter as she stepped out of her car, the autumn wind carrying whispers of secrets through the ancient oak trees that lined the main road. "Another peaceful night in paradise," muttered Officer James Wright, emerging from the passenger seat. His cynical tone didn't match the picturesque scene before them. Quaint cottages with flower boxes, a centuries-old church spire piercing the darkness, and the gentle babble of the brook that gave the village its name. But appearances could be deceiving, and Sarah had learned that the most beautiful places often harbored the darkest secrets. The call had come. And at 11:47 p.m., Margaret Thornfield, the village librarian and unofficial keeper of local history, had been found dead in her cottage garden. The caller, a neighbor named Helen Carpenter, claimed she'd noticed Margaret's back door standing wide open, unusual for a woman who locked her doors religiously every night at 9 o'clock dot. As they approached the cottage, Sarah noticed the perfectly maintained garden, even in late October. Rose bushes stood in neat rows, their last blooms defying the approaching winter. A small greenhouse glowed softly in the moonlight, and stone paths wound between herb gardens that released their fragrance into the cool air. Detective Chun? A woman in her 60s approached them, wrapping a quilted robe around her thin frame. "I'm Helen Carpenter. I made the call." Helen's eyes were red-rimmed, but her voice remained steady. She pointed toward the back of Margaret's cottage, where yellow police tape now fluttered in the breeze. "I was letting my cat in when I saw her door open." Margaret never left doors open, never. She was particular about security. "When I called out and got no answer, I went to check." Helen's voice cracked slightly. She was lying by the herb garden, just still. Sarah nodded, making notes in her worn leather notebook. "How well did you know Mrs. Thornfield?" "We've been neighbors for 20 years. Margaret kept to herself mostly, but she was kind. She'd bring me books from the library, especially the mystery novels I love." Helen managed a weak smile. "She said I had a keen eye for solving puzzles." The local constable, a young man named David Mills, approached them nervously. "Detective, the coroner's finished his preliminary examination. No obvious signs of violence, but—" He hesitated. "But?" Sarah prompted. "There's something odd." "She's clutching this." David held up an evidence bag containing a small, tarnished locket. Wasn't wearing it, she was holding it tight in her fist. Sarah examined the locket through the clear plastic. It was old, possibly Victorian, with an intricate floral pattern etched into the silver surface. "Any idea whose it might be?" Helen stepped closer, squinting at the locket. Her face went pale. "Oh my ... I haven't seen that in decades. You recognize it?" "It belonged to Eleanor Whitmore. She disappeared from the village in 1963. Everyone assumed she'd run away to the city. She was only 19, rebellious, always talking about leaving this place behind." Helen's voice dropped to a whisper. "At that locket, Eleanor never went anywhere without it. Her grandmother gave it to her." Sarah felt the familiar tingle that came with the first piece of a puzzle clicking into place. "Tell me about Eleanor's disappearance." "It was October, just like now. One day she was there, the next she wasn't. Her parents found a note saying she'd gone to London to pursue her dreams of becoming an actress. But—" Helen glanced around nervously. There were whispers. People said she'd been having an affair with a married man. Some thought she'd been killed to keep the scandal quiet. "Any idea who the married man was supposed to be?" Helen shook her head. The older generation kept those secrets locked away. Margaret would have known, though. She was fascinated by the village's history, especially the unsolved mysteries. As they spoke, more villagers began to gather at the edges of the police cordon. Sarah noticed how they clustered in small groups, whispering among themselves. A tall man in his 70s stood apart from the others, his weathered face grim as he stared at Margaret's cottage. "Who's that?" Sarah asked, nodding toward the solitary figure. "Thomas Whitmore," Helen replied. "Eleanor's older brother. He's the only family member still living in the village. Never married, never left. Some say he's been waiting his whole life for Eleanor to come home." Sarah studied Thomas Whitmore's face in the moonlight. Even from a distance, she could see the pain etched in his features, the look of a man who'd carried an unbearable weight for 60 years. "I need to examine the cottage," she told Officer Wright. "And tomorrow we'll need to speak with everyone who knew Margaret well. Start with Mr. Whitmore." Inside Margaret's cottage, Sarah was struck by the meticulous organization. Books lined every wall, sorted by subject and alphabetized within each category. Local history took up an entire section, with several volumes about prominent village families. Margaret's desk was equally organized, with neat stacks of correspondence and research notes. Sarah picked up a leather-bound journal from the desk. The final entry was dated 3 days earlier. The truth has a way of surfacing, even after 60 years. Some secrets are too heavy to carry to the grave. Tomorrow, I will do what should have been done long ago. James, look at this. Sarah showed him the journal entry. Sounds like she knew something that was eating at her. James examined the handwriting. Question is, what did she plan to do about it? Sarah turned the page, but it was blank. She flipped back through earlier entries, finding months of routine observations about village life, book recommendations for patrons, and gardening notes. But scattered throughout were cryptic references to the Whitmore matter and justice. Delayed, but not denied. A photograph fell out of the journal, black and white, clearly from the 1960s. It showed a young woman with dark hair and bright eyes, wearing the same locket they'd found in Margaret's hand. On the back, in Margaret's neat handwriting, Eleanor Whitmore, age 19, taken 2 weeks before her disappearance. Sarah stared at the photograph, studying Eleanor's face. The young woman looked defiant, almost challenging, as if she were daring the world to try to contain her spirit. "She doesn't look like someone planning to run away quietly," Sarah murmured. "Maybe that's the point," James replied. "Maybe someone made sure she couldn't run at all." As they continued searching the cottage, Sarah found more evidence of Margaret's investigation into Eleanor's disappearance. Hidden in a hollowed-out book were newspaper clippings from 1963, maps of the village and surrounding countryside, and a list of names with question marks beside them. At the top of the list, underlined 3 times, was a name that made Sarah's pulse quicken. Rev. William Ashford. The missing months? "The Reverend," Sarah said, showing the list to James. Helen mentioned Eleanor was supposedly having an affair with a married man. A scandal involving the village priest would have been explosive in 1963. Still would be today, James noted. But if Reverend Ashford was involved, he'd be long dead by now. It's been 60 years. Sarah nodded, but something nagged at her. Margaret had written tomorrow. "I will do what should have been done long ago," just 3 days before her death. If she'd uncovered new evidence about a 60-year-old crime, who would kill to keep it buried? As they prepared to leave the cottage, Sarah took one last look around the sitting room. Her eyes fell on a small side table where Margaret kept her reading glasses and current book. Next to them was a handwritten note that made Sarah's blood run cold. "Some secrets die with the keeper. Others live on to destroy the innocent. Choose wisely." The note wasn't signed, but the paper was expensive, cream-colored with a subtle watermark. This wasn't a casual threat. It was a warning from someone with resources and connections. Sarah carefully bagged the note as evidence. Outside, the crowd of villagers had grown larger, their voices carrying on the night air. She noticed several people dispersing quickly when they saw the police emerging from the cottage, as if they feared being questioned. "Detective?" Helen Carpenter approached again, her earlier composure cracking. "There's something else. Last week, Margaret asked me strange questions about the old families in the village. She wanted to know about inheritances, property transfers, things that happened in the 1960s. "What kind of property transfers?" "The Ashford land, mainly. The Reverend's family owned a large tract on the outskirts of the village. After he died in 1965, there was some controversy about his will. The church got most of it, but some parcels were sold to developers." Sarah made another note. "Who handled the will?" "The Thornfield law firm. Margaret's late husband was the solicitor who settled the estate." Helen paused, realization dawning on her face. Margaret would have had access to all those old files. She kept them when her husband died. The pieces were starting to form a picture, but Sarah knew they were still missing crucial elements. What had Margaret discovered in those old legal files? And who would kill to keep 60-year-old secrets buried? As she drove back to the police station through the moonlit countryside, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret Thornfield's death was just the beginning. The locket clutched in the librarian's hand wasn't just evidence of an old mystery. It was a message from the past, demanding justice for Eleanor Whitmore. But in a village where everyone knew everyone else's business, the truth could be more dangerous than the lie. And as the harvest moon set behind the hills, Sarah realized she was hunting a killer who had already waited 60 years to strike again. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Millbrook Village Cemetery as Sarah stood before Eleanor Whitmore's empty grave. The headstone was modest, bearing only her name, birth year, and the inscription, "Gone but not forgotten." The date of death was conspicuously absent. Her parents bought the plot when she first disappeared, Thomas Whitmore explained, his voice hoarse from decades of grief. They kept hoping she'd come home, but as years passed, they needed somewhere to remember her. At 74, Thomas was a tall, gaunt man with silver hair and intelligent blue eyes that held too much sorrow. His hands shook slightly as he placed a fresh bouquet of white lily on the empty grave. "Mr. Whitmore," Sarah began gently, "I know this is difficult, but I need you to tell me about your sister's disappearance. Was there anything the police missed back then?" Thomas was quiet for so long that Sarah wondered if he'd heard the question. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of 6 decades of unanswered questions. Eleanor was complicated. Beautiful, intelligent, but restless. She felt trapped in this village, said it was suffocating her dreams. He smiled sadly. She wanted to be an actress. Can you believe it? In 1963, that was scandalous enough for a village girl. But you don't think she ran away to pursue that dream? No. The word came out sharp and definitive. Eleanor was impulsive, yes, but she wasn't cruel. She would never have left without saying goodbye to me. We were close, despite the 8-year age gap. Sarah pulled out the photograph from Margaret's journal. Thomas's breath caught when he saw it. "Where did you find this?" Margaret Thornfield had it. "She was investigating your sister's disappearance." Thomas stared at the photograph, tears forming in his eyes. This was taken at the Harvest Festival in 1963, just 2 weeks before she vanished. "I remember, because she was wearing our grandmother's locket." He looked up at Sarah. "The same locket you found in Margaret's hand?" "Yes. Do you know how Margaret might have come to possess it?" Thomas shook his head. "Eleanor never went anywhere without that locket. If someone else had it, He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung heavy in the morning air. As they walked back toward the village center, Thomas continued sharing memories of his sister. The official investigation lasted less than a month. The police found her note, packed some of her belongings to make it look like she'd planned to leave, and closed the case. But there were things that didn't make sense, such as her passport was still in her bedroom drawer. She'd applied for it months earlier, dreaming of traveling to America. Why would she leave it behind if she was running away? Thomas paused by an old oak tree, its branches heavy with autumn leaves. And her diary. Eleanor wrote in it religiously, but the last entry was 3 weeks before she disappeared. She never went that long without writing. Sarah made careful notes as they approached the village library. The building was closed, black ribbons hanging from the door in Margaret's memory, but Sarah could see through the windows to the neat rows of books and the local history section that had consumed Margaret's attention in her final days. "Mr. Whitmore, did your sister ever mention being afraid of someone? Or having any kind of relationship that worried her?" Thomas's step faltered. There were rumors. People said she was seeing a married man, but Eleanor never confided in me about her romantic life. She was protective of her secrets. He paused, seeming to wrestle with something. But about a month before she disappeared, she came home one evening very upset. She'd been crying, which wasn't like her. When I asked what was wrong, she said she'd discovered something terrible about someone she trusted. Did she say what she'd discovered? No. She just said that some people weren't who they pretended to be, and that she didn't know what to do with the knowledge she had. Sarah felt another piece of the puzzle shift into place. Was this around the time Reverend Ashford was having his difficulties? Thomas gave her a sharp look. What do you know about William Ashford? Only what I've found in Margaret's research. She seemed particularly interested in some missing months in his life. Ah. Thomas nodded grimly. Few people remember that scandal now. In the spring of 1963, Reverend Ashford disappeared for almost 3 months. The church said he was on a spiritual retreat, but there were whispers that he'd been sent away for inappropriate behavior with young women in the parish. Was Eleanor one of those women? I don't know. But when he returned that summer, he was a changed man. Nervous, jumpy, always looking over his shoulder, and he seemed particularly uncomfortable around Eleanor. They had reached the church, its ancient stone walls warm in the morning sunlight. Sarah noticed a new vicar tending the garden, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and dirt-stained gloves. That's Reverend Patricia Holmes, Thomas explained. She took over the parish 5 years ago when old Reverend Matthews retired. She's been wonderful about helping people research the church's history. Sarah approached Reverend Holmes, who straightened up from her rosebush with a welcoming smile. You must be the detective investigating Margaret's death, she said, extending a dirt-stained hand. Such a tragedy. Margaret was one of our most devoted congregation members, even though she rarely spoke during services. Reverend Holmes, I'm hoping you might help me understand something about the church's history, specifically about Reverend William Ashford. The smile faded from Patricia's face. Margaret asked me about him as well, just last month. I'm afraid that's a rather dark chapter in our parish's history. What can you tell me? Patricia glanced around, then gestured toward the church door. Perhaps we should speak inside. The interior of the church was cool and peaceful, with afternoon light filtering through stained glass windows to cast colorful patterns on the warm wooden pews. Patricia led them to a small office behind the altar. When I took over this parish, I inherited not just the building, but also its secrets. She began, settling into a chair behind a desk covered with parish records. William Ashford served here from 1959 to 1965. By all accounts, he was charming, popular with the younger members of the congregation. Perhaps too popular. What happened in the spring of 1963? According to the diocesan records, there were complaints. 3 young women accused him of inappropriate conduct. Rather than face a formal investigation, Ashford agreed to undergo counseling and spiritual rehabilitation at a monastery in Scotland. Sarah leaned forward. What happened when he returned? He finished out his term here, but he was clearly struggling. The senior church officials were preparing to transfer him to another parish when he died suddenly in early 1965. Heart attack, officially, though he was only 38 years old. Do you know the names of the women who made complaints? Patricia hesitated. The records are confidential, but... She looked at Thomas, who nodded encouragingly. One of them was Eleanor Whitmore. The other 2 left the village shortly after Ashford returned from Scotland. They were never seen again. The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. 3 young women had accused a respected clergyman of misconduct. One disappeared mysteriously. 2 others fled the village, and the clergyman died suddenly before he could be transferred. Margaret found something in the old church records, didn't she? Sarah asked. Yes. She discovered that Reverend Ashford had been keeping a private journal during his final years. When he died, it should have been destroyed according to church protocol, but it was overlooked in the chaos of settling his affairs. Margaret found it in a box of uncatalogued materials in the church basement. Do you still have this journal? Patricia's face grew grim. That's the problem. Margaret borrowed it 3 weeks ago to study it more carefully. She promised to return it, but ... She gestured helplessly. Now it's gone. I assume it was in her cottage somewhere? Reverend Holmes, in your opinion, was William Ashford capable of murder? The question hung in the air like incense smoke. Patricia stared at her folded hands for a long moment before answering. After reading his journal, yes. I believe he was capable of almost anything to protect his reputation and position. The entries from his final months were ... disturbing. Paranoid, obsessed with the idea that people were conspiring against him. And there were references to solving problems permanently. Thomas had been listening in stunned silence, but now he spoke up. If Ashford killed my sister, he's been dead for almost 60 years. He can't be punished for his crimes now. No, Sarah agreed, but someone killed Margaret to keep this secret. Buried. Someone who's very much alive and has a lot to lose if the truth comes out. As they prepared to leave the church, Patricia pulled Sarah aside. Detective, there's one more thing. Margaret mentioned that she'd discovered a connection between Ashford's death and the current village leadership. She seemed to think that someone with power and influence had been protecting Ashford's reputation all these years. Any idea who? She mentioned the Hartwell family specifically. They've been prominent in village affairs for generations. Jonathan. Hartwell is the current mayor, and his father was mayor during the 1960s. Another piece of the puzzle. Sarah thanked Patricia and stepped back into the afternoon sunlight, her mind racing. They were dealing with more than just a 60-year-old murder. They were uncovering a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of village society, protected by people who had spent decades keeping the truth buried. But Margaret Thornfield had found that truth, and it had cost her life. Now Sarah had to decide whether to let sleeping secrets lie, or risk her own safety to bring justice for both Eleanor Whitmore and Margaret Thornfield. As they walked back toward the police station, Thomas suddenly stopped. Detective, there's something else I should tell you. About the night Eleanor disappeared. Sarah waited, sensing that whatever Thomas was about to reveal would change everything. I lied to the police back then. Eleanor didn't disappear on October 15th, like everyone believes. I saw her 2 days later, on the 17th. She came to my window in the middle of the night, terrified, begging me to help her. She said she had proof. That would destroy someone important, but she was afraid to go to the police because she didn't know who she could trust. What happened? I told her to come inside, that we'd figure it out together. But she was too scared. She said she had hidden the evidence somewhere safe and would come back for me when she'd decided what to do. Thomas's voice broke. That was the last time I saw her alive. I never told anyone because I thought if people knew she'd still been in the village, they'd know she hadn't run away. I thought it would make them search harder. Instead, it might have helped identify her killer sooner, Sarah said gently. Yes, and now Margaret is dead too, and I can't help wondering if I could have prevented it all those years ago. As the sun set behind the village church spire, Sarah realized they weren't just investigating two murders separated by 60 years. They were uncovering a web of secrets that someone had killed twice to protect and would likely kill again if a cornered dot. The harvest moon was rising again, and somewhere in Millbrook Village, a killer was watching and waiting. The Hartwell family estate sat on a hill overlooking Millbrook Village, like a medieval castle surveying its domain. As Sarah and James drove up the winding gravel drive the next morning, Sarah couldn't help but notice the pristine gardens, the freshly painted outbuildings, and the general air of prosperity that surrounded the property. Money talks, James muttered, eyeing the fleet of expensive cars parked in front of the Georgian mansion. Question is, what secrets is it trying to keep quiet? Jonathan Hartwell met them at the front door himself, a gesture that would have seemed hospitable if not for the calculated nature of his smile. In his mid-50s, he carried himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly styled, and his handshake was just a touch too firm. Detective Chun, Officer Wright, please, come in. I'm happy to help with your investigation in any way I can. He led them through a foyer that could have housed Sarah's entire apartment, past oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors, and into a mahogany-paneled study that reeked of old money and older. Secrets. Terrible business about Margaret, Hartwell began, settling into a leather chair behind an antique desk. She was a pillar of our community. I can't imagine who would want to harm her. Sarah studied his face carefully. Mr. Hartwell, we have reason to believe Margaret's death is connected to her research into Eleanor Whitmore's disappearance in 1963. Your father was mayor at the time. Did he ever discuss the case with you? A flicker of something annoyance, fear, crossed Hartwell's features before the practiced politician's mask slipped back into place. My father rarely discussed his official duties at home. I was only 15 when the Whitmore girl ran away. Children weren't privy to such matters in those days. So you believe Eleanor ran away? Of course. The police investigated thoroughly and found no evidence of foul play. Her note made her intentions clear. Hartwell leaned back in his chair, projecting casual confidence, but Sarah noticed his hands were clenched on the armrests. What about Reverend William Ashford? Did your father ever mention him? This time, Hartwell couldn't hide his reaction. His face went pale, and for a moment, he looked genuinely shaken. Reverend Ashford died of a heart attack in 1965. What could he possibly have to do with Margaret's death? That's what we're trying to determine, Sarah replied evenly. Margaret seemed particularly interested in some missing months in his life during 1963. She also believed there was a connection between his death and current village leadership. Hartwell stood abruptly, moving to the window that overlooked the village below. Detective Chun, I hope you're not suggesting that my family has been involved in some sort of cover-up. The Hartwells have served this community faithfully for 4 generations. I'm not suggesting anything, Mr. Hartwell. I'm asking direct questions and hoping for honest answers. When Hartwell turned back to face them, his mask had slipped entirely. The confident politician was gone, replaced by a man who looked every one of his 55 years. My father is dead, Detective. He's been gone for 10 years. Even if he had kept secrets, they died with him. Not all secrets die with their keepers, Sarah said, echoing the note they'd found at Margaret's cottage. Sometimes they're passed, down like family heirlooms. Hartwell's eyes sharpened. Where did you hear that phrase? Someone left it as a warning for Margaret. Any idea who might have written it? No, he said quickly. Too quickly. I'm afraid I can't help you there. James spoke for the first time since they'd arrived. Mr. Hartwell, do you know why Margaret Thornfield would have been researching property transfers from the 1960s? Specifically, the disposal of Reverend Ashford's estate? If possible, Hartwell went even paler. That was a long time ago. I wouldn't know anything about property transfers from before I was an adult. But Sarah was studying a photograph. On Hartwell's desk, a family portrait from what looked like the early 1960s. A teenage Jonathan stood beside a man who could only be his father, and in the background, partly visible, was a familiar figure in clerical collar. Is that Reverend Ashford in the photograph? She asked. Hartwell followed her gaze and seemed to shrink into himself. My father was active in church affairs. The Reverend was often at our house for dinner or parish business. You knew him well. Then, as well as any teenager knows his family's friends. Hartwell's voice had taken on a defensive edge. Look, Detective, I don't know what Margaret thought she'd discovered, but I can assure you that whatever happened 60 years ago has no bearing on her death. Sarah stood to leave, but paused at the study door. Mr. Hartwell, one final question. Where were you 3 nights ago, between 10 p.m. and midnight? At home with my wife. We were watching television. The answer came too pat, too rehearsed. Is there anything else, Detective? As they walked back to their car, James shook his head. He's lying about something. The question is what and how much. Did you see the way he reacted when I mentioned the property transfers? Sarah asked. And that family photograph, But if we dig into those records, we'll find the Hartwell family benefited somehow from Ashford's death. Their next stop was the village records office, housed in a cramped basement beneath the town hall. The clerk, an elderly woman named Rose Fletcher, seemed nervous as she pulled out boxes of documents from the 1960s. Margaret was here just last. Weak, Rose explained, her hands shaking slightly as she sorted through property deeds and transfer documents. She was very interested in the Ashford estate settlement. Asked specifically about any sales that happened quickly after his death. What did she find? Several irregularities. The estate was supposed to go to the church, according to Ashford's will. But within weeks of his death, 3 valuable parcels of land were sold to private buyers at well below market value. Sarah examined the documents Rose laid out on the narrow table. As signatures and stamps looked official, but something felt off about the timing and prices. Who bought the land? That's the interesting part. All 3 purchases were made through a company called Millbrook Holdings. The records show it was owned by. Rose paused, checking her notes. Harold Hartwell, Jonathan's father. So the current mayor's father bought church land at cut-rate prices right after the Reverend's death? James whistled low. That's quite a coincidence. Gets better, Rose continued. 2 of those parcels were sold again within 5 years, this time at full market value. The profits would have been substantial. Sarah studied the property maps. What about the third parcel? Still owned by the Hartwell family. It's the land their current estate sits on. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. Reverend Ashford had been accused of inappropriate conduct. 3 young women had made complaints. One disappeared mysteriously. The other 2 fled. Ashford died suddenly, and his estate was carved up to benefit the mayor's family. Rose, did Margaret make copies of these documents? Yes, she had her own copying machine. Said she wanted to study them at home. Rose's face crumpled. She seemed so excited about what she'd found, like she was finally going to solve an old puzzle. I never thought. It's not your fault, Sarah assured her, but these documents might be why she was killed. Is there somewhere safe we can store the originals? Rose locked the documents in the office safe, but Sarah couldn't shake a feeling they were still vulnerable. Someone had killed Margaret to keep these secrets buried, and they were clearly prepared to kill again. As they drove back through the village center, Sarah's phone rang. It was the coroner with Margaret's autopsy results. Natural causes, he reported. Heart failure brought on by extreme stress. But detective, there's something else. She had defensive wounds on her hands and trace amounts of a mild sedative in her blood. Someone confronted her that night, possibly threatened her. The shock and fear literally stopped her heart. So she was murdered, just not in the traditional sense. That's my professional opinion, yes. Sarah hung up and turned to James. Margaret was literally frightened to death. Someone came to her cottage that night, probably demanding she destroy her research. The stress of the confrontation killed her. Any idea who? I think it's time we had another conversation with Mr. Hartwell. But first, let's see what Thomas Whitmore can tell us about Harold Hartwell's relationship with his sister. They found Thomas in his small cottage on the outskirts of the village, tending a garden that clearly hadn't been maintained with Margaret's skill. He looked up when they arrived, hope and fear warring in his eyes. Have you found something? Sarah showed him the property records. Thomas, did Eleanor ever mention the Hartwell family? Particularly any connection to Reverend Ashford? Thomas studied the documents, his face growing grim. She worked part-time as a secretary for several local businesses that summer, including Harold Hartwell's construction company. She mentioned that he and the Reverend were close friends, often meeting privately to discuss business matters. What kind of business matters? I don't know, but Eleanor found it strange. She said Harold Hartwell didn't seem like a particularly religious man, yet he was always consulting with Ashford about something. And after the Reverend returned from his retreat, Eleanor said their meetings became more frequent and more secretive. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Did she ever say what she thought they were discussing? Land deals? Eleanor was good with figures, and she noticed discrepancies in some of Hartwell's project budgets. Large sums of money that couldn't be accounted for. She thought he might be embezzling from his clients. But if she suspected embezzlement, why didn't she go to the police? Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Because she discovered that one of the clients being cheated was the church, and Harold Hartwell was using his ill-gotten gains to buy church property at artificial prices. The Reverend was helping him defraud his own parish. The full scope of the conspiracy was becoming clear. Ashford had been corrupt, not just in his personal conduct, but in his professional duties as well. He and Harold Hartwell had been stealing from the church, using insider information to buy valuable property at below-market prices. Eleanor found proof of this. She said she had documents that would send both men to prison. That's what she was carrying when she came to my window that last night. She'd gathered evidence of their crimes, but she was afraid to go to the authorities because she didn't know how deep the corruption went. What happened to those documents? She said she'd hidden them somewhere safe, somewhere neither Ashford nor Hartwell would think to look. Thomas looked up at Sarah with desperate eyes. Do you think, could Eleanor have been killed because of what she knew about their business dealings? I think Eleanor was killed because she was the only person. Who could prove that two of the most respected men in the village were criminals? Sarah replied grimly. And I think Margaret Thornfield was killed 60 years later because she found Eleanor's evidence. As the sun set over Millbrook Village once again, Sarah realized they were close to solving both murders. But knowing who had killed Eleanor and Margaret was only half the battle. Now they had to prove it and catch a killer who had successfully covered their tracks for 6 decades. The harvest moon was rising, and somewhere in the village, the truth was waiting to be uncovered. Sarah just hoped they could find it before the killer struck again. The abandoned quarry lay hidden in the woods 2 miles outside Millbrook Village, its jagged edges softened by 6 decades of weather and neglect. Sarah stood at the rim, flashlight, beam cutting through the morning mist as she studied the rocky depths below. You really think Eleanor Whitmore's body is down there? James asked, peering uncertainly into the shadowy pit. It's the perfect hiding place, Sarah replied, checking her climbing gear one more time. Remote, deep, and owned by the Hartwell Construction Company in 1963. Harold Hartwell had access, knew the terrain, and could ensure no one would come looking here. The search team had arrived an hour earlier, along with specialized equipment for recovering remains from difficult locations. Sarah had spent the previous evening poring over Thomas Whitmore's final revelations about his sister's investigation into the Ashford-Hartwell conspiracy. She was methodical, Thomas had explained, showing Sarah a hand-drawn map Eleanor had left hidden in his attic. She documented everything: financial records, meeting times, even photographs she took of Harold and Ashford together. She'd been building a case for months. The map showed 3 locations marked with Eleanor's neat handwriting: Evidence Cache 1, Church Basement; Evidence Cache 2, Old Mill Foundation; and Evidence Cache 3, Quarry Overlook. Margaret Thornfield had found the first cache Ashford's journal and financial records hidden in the church basement. But Eleanor had been too smart to keep all her evidence in one place. As the recovery team began their descent into the quarry, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from the forensics lab. The handwriting analysis was complete. The threatening note found at Margaret's cottage had been written by Jonathan Hartwell. Looks like our current mayor inherited more than just political ambitions from his father, James observed, reading over Sarah's shoulder. The question is, how much did he know about his father's crimes, and when did he find out? Their answer came sooner than expected. A black sedan pulled up to the quarry site, and Jonathan Hartwell emerged, flanked by 2 expensive-looking lawyers. His earlier composure was completely gone, replaced by the desperate panic of a man watching his world crumble. Detective Chun, I demand to know what you're doing on my family's property. Sarah showed him the search warrant. Looking for Eleanor Whitmore's remains, Mr. Hartwell, and any evidence she might have hidden before she was murdered. This is ridiculous. Eleanor Whitmore ran away 60 years ago. My father had nothing to do with her disappearance. Then you won't mind if we search, Sarah replied calmly. Unless you have something to hide. Hartwell's lawyers whispered urgently in his ears, but he pushed them away. I want to know who gave you permission to dig up ancient history. Margaret. Thornfield gave us permission, Sarah said, with her life. She died because she uncovered the truth about what your father and Reverend Ashford did to Eleanor. You have no proof of any connection between detective. One of the search team members called up from the quarry floor. We found something. Sarah rappelled down the rocky face, leaving Hartwell pacing frantically at the rim. At the bottom of the quarry, partially buried under decades of fallen rocks and debris, was a metal strongbox. The lock was rusted through, and inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were Eleanor's carefully preserved documents, financial records showing systematic embezzlement from the church building fund, photographs of Harold Hartwell and William Ashford, meeting at night, exchanging envelopes thick with cash, property deeds with forged signatures, and most damning of all, a confession letter Eleanor had written but never sent, detailing everything she'd discovered. I know what they've been doing. The letter began in Eleanor's neat handwriting. Harold Hartwell has been stealing from the church renovation fund, and Reverend Ashford has been helping him by providing insider information about upcoming property sales. They've defrauded the parish of thousands of pounds, and when the Reverend was accused of improper conduct with young women, Hartwell helped cover it up to protect their partnership. But it was the letter's final paragraph that made Sarah's blood run cold. I confronted them tonight, demanding they confess to the authorities. Harold Hartwell became violent and threatened to kill me if I exposed them. Reverend Ashford seemed frightened, but said nothing to stop him. I'm hiding this evidence in 3 locations where they'll never think to look. If something happens to me, I pray someone will find the truth and bring them to justice. The letter was dated October 17th, 1963, the night Thomas had seen Eleanor at his window. There's more, the search team leader called out. Behind the strongbox, they'd found human remains. Female, approximately 19 years old, wearing the tattered remnants of a 1960s dress. Around the skeleton's neck was a broken chain, the chain that had once held. Eleanor's grandmother's locket. Sarah climbed back up to find Hartwell in handcuffs, his lawyers arguing futilely with the uniformed officers who'd arrived as backup. But as they loaded him into the police car, he broke free from his restraints, just long enough to grab Sarah's arm. You don't understand, he hissed. My father never told me. I didn't know what he'd done until Margaret started asking questions. I only tried to stop her from destroying our family's reputation. By threatening her? By frightening an elderly woman to death? I never meant for her to die. I just wanted her to stop digging up the past. But she wouldn't listen, she said. Eleanor deserved justice, that the truth had to come out no matter who it hurt. Sarah pulled away from his grip. Eleanor did deserve justice. And now, finally, she'd get it. As the police car pulled away with Hartwell inside, Sarah turned back to the quarry, where the recovery team was carefully extracting Eleanor's remains. 60 years after her murder, the young woman who died trying to expose corruption was finally going home. But the story wasn't over yet. As they prepared to leave the quarry site, Sarah's phone rang. It was Reverend Patricia Holmes calling. From the church. "Detective, you need to come quickly. We found something in the church basement, something Margaret missed." 30 minutes later, Sarah stood in the musty basement beneath Millbrook's ancient church, staring at a hidden compartment behind the furnace. Inside was another cache of documents, these ones bearing William Ashford's distinctive handwriting. "It's his complete confession," Patricia explained, her face pale in the basement's dim light. "Everything Eleanor accused him of, and more. He admits to the embezzlement, the property fraud, and ... double quote. She swallowed hard. To Eleanor's murder." Sarah read through Ashford's final journal entries with growing horror. The Reverend described, in chilling detail, how he and Harold Hartwell had lured Eleanor to the quarry on the night of October 17, 1963, under the pretense of wanting to negotiate. When she refused to destroy her evidence, Harold had struck her with a rock in a fit of rage. "I should have stopped him," Ashford had written, "but I was a coward. We buried her body and her evidence together, thinking the secret would die with her. But secrets have a way of demanding justice, and I know my time is running out." The final entry was dated February 15, 1965, just days before Ashford's supposed heart attack. "I can no longer bear the weight of what we've done. Harold thinks we're safe, but I know Eleanor's spirit will not rest until the truth is known. I am taking my own life rather than face the disgrace of exposure, but I pray that someday someone will find this confession and give Eleanor the justice she deserves." Sarah closed the journal with shaking hands. So Ashford didn't die of a heart attack. He committed suicide out of guilt. "It would seem so," Patricia agreed. "The question is, did Harold Hartwell know about this confession? I don't think so. If he had, he would have destroyed it years ago." Sarah looked around the basement, imagining Margaret Thornfield searching through boxes of old records, slowly, piecing together the truth. Margaret found Ashford's journal, but missed this hidden compartment. She knew most of the story, but not that Ashford had confessed to the actual murder. As they emerged from the basement into the afternoon sunlight, Sarah reflected on the tragic chain of events that had started with one young woman's courage and ended with another woman's determination to see justice done. Eleanor Whitmore had died because she refused to let corruption go unpunished. Margaret Thornfield had died because she believed Eleanor's story deserved to be told. And now, finally, both women could rest in peace. But as Sarah drove back through the village center, past the shops and cottages where people were already whispering about the day's dramatic events, she couldn't help but wonder how many other secrets lay buried in Millbrook's picturesque streets. How many other truths were waiting for someone brave enough to dig them up? The harvest moon was setting behind the church spire, and for the first time in 60 years, its light fell on a village where justice had finally been served. 3 days later, Sarah stood in the Millbrook Village Cemetery once again, but this time she wasn't alone. Nearly 200 villagers had gathered for Eleanor Whitmore's proper burial, their faces solemn in the flickering light of candles and lanterns. Thomas Whitmore, now 74 and finally at peace, placed his sister's grandmother's locket and the simple wooden casket beside her remains. "She's home now," he whispered, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks, that the full truth had emerged over the past. Few days as investigators combed through 60 years of hidden evidence. Harold Hartwell and William Ashford had been running their corruption scheme for months before Eleanor discovered them. When she threatened to expose them, Harold had killed her in a moment of panic, and Ashford had helped cover it up to save his own skin. The guilt had eventually driven Ashford to suicide, but Harold Hartwell had lived with the secret for decades, building his family's fortune on blood money and stolen church funds. When he died in 2012, he'd taken the secret to his grave, or so he thought, but he'd underestimated Margaret Thornfield's dedication to historical truth and Eleanor's methodical approach to gathering evidence. Jonathan Hartwell truly didn't know about his father's crimes until Margaret started asking questions. Sarah explained to Thomas as they watched the funeral procession move toward Eleanor's grave. When he realized what she'd uncovered, he panicked and tried to frighten her into silence. He never intended to kill her. The shock and stress literally stopped her heart. 2 generations of secrets, Thomas mused, and 2 women who died because they refused to let evil triumph. As Reverend Patricia Holmes began the burial service, Sarah noticed several elderly villagers in the crowd who'd been teenagers in 1963. They stood with bowed heads, perhaps remembering the vibrant young woman Eleanor had been, or perhaps feeling guilt for accepting the official story of her disappearance without question. "We gather tonight under the harvest moon," Reverend Holmes began, her voice carrying clearly in the still air, "to finally lay Eleanor Whitmore to rest and to honor Margaret Thornfield's courage in seeking the truth. Both women remind us that justice may be delayed, but it will not be denied." The service was beautiful and heartbreaking, but Sarah found her attention drawn to the edges of the crowd, where she spotted familiar faces from her investigation. Rose Fletcher from the records office, still shaken by her unwitting role in the events. Helen Carpenter, Margaret's neighbor, clutching a handful of white roses. Several other villagers who'd known Eleanor personally, finally able to mourn her properly after 6 decades. But it was the absence of certain faces that spoke volumes. The Hartwell family plot was empty tonight. Jonathan was in custody awaiting trial, and his wife and children had left the village rather than face the scandal. Several other prominent families who'd benefited from Harold Hartwell's ill-gotten gains over the years were notably absent as well. After the burial service, the crowd moved to the village hall for a memorial reception. Sarah was surprised by how many people approached her with stories about Eleanor, tales of kindness, intelligence, and determination that painted a picture of a young woman who truly cared about right and wrong. "She would have made a wonderful actress," said elderly Mrs. Morrison, who'd been Eleanor's drama teacher. "She had such passion, such fire. But more than that, she had integrity. She couldn't stand seeing people being hurt or cheated." "That integrity cost her everything," Sarah replied. "No," Mrs. Morrison corrected gently. "That integrity gave her everything that truly matters. She died fighting for what was right, and now her story will inspire others to do the same." As the evening wore on, Sarah found herself in conversation with Thomas, who seemed years younger, now that the burden of uncertainty had been lifted from his shoulders. "I keep thinking about that night she came to my window," he confided. "She was so scared, but also so determined. She said she had to do the right thing, even if it meant putting herself in danger. She was remarkably brave for someone so young. She was remarkable in every way. Thomas smiled sadly. I just wish I could have protected her better. You were 27 years old and had no idea what you were up against, Sarah reminded him. Harold Hartwell was a powerful man with everything to lose. Even if you'd gone to the police with Eleanor that night, there's no guarantee they would have believed her accusations against such respected members of the community. Maybe not, but at least she wouldn't have died alone. Sarah touched his arm gently. She didn't die alone, Thomas. She died knowing that someone who loved her was fighting for the same truth she died to protect. Margaret Thornfield carried on Eleanor's mission, and in the end, that's what brought justice for both of them. Detective? Sarah turned to find a young woman approaching mid-20s, with dark hair and intelligent eyes that reminded her strongly of someone. I'm Emma Thornfield, the woman said. Margaret's granddaughter. I wanted to thank you for finding the truth. I'm sorry for your loss, Sarah replied. Your grandmother was a remarkable woman. She was obsessed with this case for the past year, Emma explained. I kept telling her to let it go, that some mysteries are better left unsolved. I was wrong. She did what she thought was right. Just like Eleanor Whitmore did. Emma looked up at the harvest moon. Grandmother used to say that the moon remembers everything, all the secrets, all the lies, all the truths that people try to hide. She said that's why she loved doing her research by moonlight. She felt like the moon was helping her see clearly. Sarah followed Emma's gaze upward. Maybe it was. I'm keeping grandmother's house, Emma continued, and I'm going to continue her work researching local history. There are other mysteries in this village, other secrets that need to be brought to light. Be careful, Sarah warned. Some people will do anything to keep the past buried. So will some people to uncover it, Emma replied with a smile that reminded Sarah powerfully of Margaret's determined expression in the photographs she'd seen Dot as Sarah drove back to her hotel that night. She reflected on the strange alchemy that had transformed tragedy into justice. Eleanor Whitmore's murder had been a crime of greed and cowardice, but her death had also planted seeds of truth that had eventually bloomed 60 years later. Margaret Thornfield had paid the ultimate price for watering those seeds, but her sacrifice had ensured that Eleanor's story would finally be told. And now Emma Thornfield would carry on the tradition, armed with her grandmother's courage and her great-aunt Eleanor's integrity. The harvest moon was setting behind her as Sarah reached the outskirts of Millbrook Village. In her rearview mirror, she could see the church spire silhouetted against the sky, and beyond that, the cemetery where two brave women finally rested in peace. Some secrets, Sarah thought, are too heavy to carry to the grave. They demand to be told, no matter how long. It takes, no matter what the cost. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, there are people willing to pay that cost in service of truth and justice. The village of Millbrook slept peacefully under the stars, its ancient streets no longer haunted by Eleanor Whitmore's restless spirit. Justice had finally been served, and the harvest moon had witnessed it all. But Emma Thornfield was right. There were other mysteries waiting to be solved, other truths waiting to be uncovered. And as long as there were people brave enough to ask difficult questions and refuse to accept easy answers, Those truths would eventually find their way into the light. The Harvest Moon's work in Millbrook was done, but its watchful eye would continue to shine on other villages, other secrets, other seekers of truth who were willing to risk everything for justice. Sarah smiled as she drove into the night, carrying with her the story of two women who changed a village forever, simply by refusing to let the truth stay buried. It was the kind of story that gave her faith in humanity and reminded her why she'd become a detective in the first place. Some secrets die with their keepers, but others live on to honor the innocent, to right ancient wrongs, and to prove that justice, however delayed, will always find a way. The Harvest Moon bore witness to it all. Author's note: this story is dedicated to all those who seek truth in dark places, and to the understanding that justice may be delayed, but it will not be denied. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is refuse to let secrets stay buried, no matter how much time has passed or how much it might cost us. The Harvest Moon remembers everything, and eventually, so do we. Welcome to an intense crime mystery that will keep you guessing until the final page. Follow Detective Sarah Chun as she investigates what seems like a simple accidental death at the prestigious Ashworth mansion. But when she discovers a mysterious letter and uncovers decades-old secrets, Sarah realizes she's dealing with something far more sinister. A wrongfully convicted man seeks justice after 23 years in prison. But will the truth finally come to light? If you're enjoying this gripping mystery, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more thrilling crime stories. Let us know your thoughts below. What do you think really happened that night? Share this with your friends if they love a good mystery too. The grandfather clock in the Ashworth mansion struck midnight with its familiar, resonant chime. Margaret. Ashworth paused at her bedroom window, watching the rain streak down the glass like tears on a pale cheek. The storm had been brewing all evening, and now it unleashed its fury upon the sprawling estate that had been her family's pride for 3 generations. She pulled her silk robe tighter around her thin frame. At 72, Margaret had witnessed countless storms, but tonight felt different. Perhaps it was the letter that had arrived that morning, the one that threatened to unravel everything she had worked so hard to protect. Or maybe it was the way her grandson Daniel had been acting lately, his eyes hollow with secrets she dared not explore. The house groaned under the wind's assault, its century-old bones protesting the weather's violence. Margaret turned from the window and moved toward her dressing table, where the letter lay unfolded beside her jewelry box. The handwriting was unmistakable, though she hadn't seen it in over 20 years. I know what you did that summer. The truth has a way of surfacing. Doesn't it, Margaret? Expect me soon. J. Her hands trembled as she refolded the paper. James Morrison. After all these years, he had found her. The past she had buried so carefully was clawing its way back to the surface, threatening to destroy not just her reputation, but her family's future. A floorboard creaked in the hallway outside her door. Margaret froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. The servants had retired hours ago, and Daniel was supposed to be in the city for his business meeting. She strained her ears, but heard nothing except the storm's relentless percussion against the windows. She was being paranoid. The letter had unsettled her more than she cared to admit. Margaret forced herself to breathe deeply, to think rationally. James Morrison was probably just another desperate old man looking for money. She had dealt with his type before, but as she reached for her hairbrush, another sound made her blood run cold, the distinctive creak of the third step from the top of the main staircase. Someone was in the house. Margaret's mind raced through her options. The telephone was downstairs in the study. Her bedroom door had no lock or renovation oversight from the 1960s that she had never bothered to correct. The servants' quarters were in the east wing, too far to reach safely. She moved quietly to her wardrobe and retrieved the small revolver her late husband had insisted she keep. Her fingers, stiff with arthritis, fumbled with the mechanism, but muscle memory from decades past guided her hands. The weapon felt heavier than she remembered. The footsteps were closer now, deliberate and measured. Whoever was approaching wasn't trying to hide their presence anymore. Margaret positioned herself behind the bedroom door, the gun raised with both hands despite their trembling. The doorknob turned slowly. "Hello, Margaret." The voice was older now, roughened by years and cigarettes, but still recognizable. "James." Morrison stepped into the moonlit room, water dripping from his dark coat onto her Persian rug. His once handsome face was weathered and scarred, but his eyes held the same cold intelligence she remembered from their youth. "You look well," he continued, his gaze taking in the elegant bedroom with its antique furnishings and silk wallpaper. "Prosperity suits you. What do you want, James?" Margaret kept the gun trained on him, though her arms ached with the effort. He smiled, revealing teeth yellowed by decades of tobacco. "Justice, Margaret, or perhaps just acknowledgement. You've lived quite comfortably all these years, haven't you? While I rotted in that prison cell for a crime I didn't commit." "You were guilty," she said, though the words tasted like ash in her mouth. "Was I?" James took a step closer, seemingly unconcerned by the weapon pointed at his chest. "Or did you? Let an innocent man take the fall for your family's sins? 23 years, Margaret. 23 years of my life stolen because you were too cowardly to tell the truth." The memories flooded back unbidden, that terrible summer when everything had gone wrong. The accident, the cover-up, the lies that had snowballed until they became an avalanche of deceit that buried James Morrison beneath its weight. "It wasn't supposed to happen that way," Margaret whispered, "but it did." James's voice was soft now, almost gentle. "And now it's time to make it right." Thunder crashed overhead, and in that moment of distraction, James lunged forward. Margaret's finger tightened on the trigger instinctively. The gun fired. James stumbled backward, his hand pressed to his shoulder, dark blood seeping between his fingers. His face showed surprise rather than pain, as if he hadn't quite believed she would actually shoot him. "You always were tougher than you looked," he said, sinking into the velvet chair beside her bed. "But this doesn't end here, Margaret. The truth will come out. I've made sure of that." Margaret lowered the gun, her hands shaking uncontrollably now. "What do you mean?" James smiled again, but this time there was no warmth in it at all. "Insurance, my dear. Letters, photographs, witness statements, all safely stored away with instructions for their release should anything happen to me. You can kill me, but you can't kill the truth." "I never meant for any of this to happen," Margaret said, tears streaming down her face. "I was protecting my family." "At the cost of mine," James replied. His voice was growing weaker, and Margaret could see the blood pooling on the floor beneath his chair. My daughter grew up thinking her father was a murderer. My wife died alone while I served time for your family's crime. Protection, Margaret? Or just cowardice? The grandfather clock chimed again 12:30 a.m., but something was wrong. The mechanism had been damaged in last month's renovation, and it had been striking twice at every half-hour mark. Margaret had grown so accustomed to the double chime that she barely noticed it anymore. But tonight, as the second chime echoed through the mansion, she realized that time had indeed struck twice for her family. Once, 23 years ago, when they had made the fateful decision that set these events in motion. And now, as the past finally caught up with them, James Morrison slumped forward in the chair, unconscious from blood loss. Margaret stared at him, this ghost from her past, who had materialized on the worst possible night to demand his pound of flesh. She could call for an ambulance, save his life, and face whatever consequences awaited her. Or she could let him bleed out and hope that his threatened insurance policy was just a bluff. As she stood frozen with indecision, she heard it again, the creak of the third step from the top. But James Morrison was already in her room, unconscious and bleeding. Someone else was in the house. Margaret raised the gun again, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it over the storm. The footsteps were faster now, urgent. Someone was running up the stairs. Grandmother? Daniel's voice called out. Grandmother, I heard a gunshot. Relief flooded through her so suddenly that she nearly collapsed. Daniel, in here. Her grandson appeared in the doorway, his expensive suit soaked with rain, his dark hair plastered to his head. He took in the scene with a quick glance. His grandmother with the gun, the bleeding man in the chair, the blood on the floor. What happened? He demanded, moving quickly to Margaret's side. James Morrison, she said simply. He came back. Daniel's face went pale. Margaret had told him the story years ago, when he had started asking questions about certain inconsistencies in the family history. He knew what James Morrison's return could mean for all of them. Is he dead? Daniel asked, checking James's pulse. Not yet, but he's unconscious. Daniel, he says he has evidence. Documents that will expose everything if something happens to him. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his mind clearly working through their options. When he looked up, Margaret saw something in his eyes that chilled her to the bone, a coldness that reminded her uncomfortably of her late husband. Then we make sure nothing happens to him, Daniel said finally. At least nothing that can be traced back to us. What do you mean? Daniel stood up, brushing off his suit. I mean, grandmother, that James Morrison broke into our house on a stormy night and suffered an unfortunate accident. Head trauma from a fall down the stairs, perhaps? These old houses can be so dangerous in the dark. Margaret stared at her. Grandson, the boy she had raised after his parents died, the young man she had put through Harvard Law School, the heir to everything she had built. When had he become capable of such calculated cruelty? Daniel, no, I won't be party to murder. It's not murder, grandmother. It's survival. Daniel's voice was calm, rational. This man threatened our family. He broke into our home with the intent to destroy us. We're simply protecting ourselves. The grandfather clock struck again 1 a.m. 2 chimes, as always. Margaret looked at the antique timepiece that had belonged to her grandfather, then at James Morrison's unconscious form, then at her grandson's cold, determined face. Time had indeed struck twice for the Ashworth family. But she was beginning to realize that the second strike might be even more devastating than the first. Detective Sarah Chun arrived at the Ashworth mansion at 7:43 a.m., her coffee still steaming in the cup holder of her unmarked sedan. The storm had passed, leaving the morning crisp and bright, but the aftermath was evident everywhere. Broken branches littered the circular drive, and one of the estate's ancient oak trees had fallen across the garden path. The call had come in 20 minutes earlier. Suspicious death at the Ashworth estate. The dispatcher had been brief, but Sarah knew the name. Everyone in Millbrook knew the Ashworth family old money. Political connections, the kind of people who made headlines when they donated to charity and got their parking tickets fixed with a phone call. Officer Martinez met her at the front door, his usually cheerful demeanor subdued. "It's a strange one, Detective. Guy named James Morrison, age 68. Found dead at the bottom of the main staircase about 6 a.m. by the housekeeper. Looks like he fell and hit his head, but ... What?" Sarah prompted, pulling on latex gloves. "Well, the family says he was a burglar, but the front door wasn't forced. No broken windows. Security system was armed all night, but somehow it didn't detect him. And Mrs. Ashworth seems pretty shaken up for someone who supposedly slept through the whole thing." Sarah nodded, already forming her initial impressions. "Where is the family now?" "Mrs. Margaret Ashworth is in the morning room with her grandson, Daniel. They're the only ones who live here full-time. The housekeeper, Elena Rodriguez, is the one who found the body. She's pretty upset." The inside of the mansion was exactly what Sarah had expected, all dark wood paneling and oil paintings, Persian rugs and furniture that cost more than most people's cars. But there was something off about the atmosphere, a tension that seemed to permeate the elegant rooms like smoke. The body lay at the base of the grand staircase, covered by a white sheet that the paramedics had placed over it. James Morrison had been a tall man, probably handsome once, though death and the years had not been kind to him. The wound on his head was consistent with a fall, but Sarah had seen enough crime scenes to know that consistency didn't always mean accuracy. Crouched beside the body, studying the position. "Martinez, did anyone move him before the paramedics arrived?" The housekeeper checked for a pulse, but she says she didn't move the body. The family claims they didn't even know he was here until Elena started screaming. Sarah stood up, her eyes tracing the path from the top of the staircase to where Morrison lay. Something nagged at her, but she couldn't put her finger on what it was yet. "Let me talk to the family." Margaret Ashworth was a small, elegant woman who managed to look perfectly composed despite the circumstances. She sat in a high-backed chair in the morning room, a cup of tea balanced delicately in her hands. Her grandson Daniel stood beside her, one hand protectively on her shoulder. "Mrs. Ashworth, I'm Detective Chun. I'm sorry for your loss." Margaret looked confused. "Loss? Detective, I've never seen that man before in my life. He was a burglar who broke into my home. Your loss of security, then. It must be very disturbing to know that someone invaded your home." Sarah watched Margaret's face carefully. "Can you tell me about last night?" I went to bed around 11:30, Margaret said, her voice steady. I take a sleeping pill every night, doctor's orders. I heard nothing until Helena woke me this morning with her screaming. And you, Mr. Ashworth? Sarah turned to Daniel. I was in the city until very late. Business meeting that ran long. Then I stayed at my apartment rather than drive back in the storm. I didn't get home until this morning, just before Elena found the body. Sarah made notes, but something felt rehearsed about their responses. Do either of you recognize the name James Morrison? The change in the room's atmosphere was subtle but unmistakable. Margaret's teacup rattled slightly against its saucer, and Daniel's hand tightened on his grandmother's shoulder. Should we? Daniel asked, his voice perhaps a bit too casual. I'm asking you. James Morrison, age 68, recently released from Millfield State Prison after serving 23 years for manslaughter. Margaret's face went pale, but her voice remained steady. I'm afraid the name means nothing to me, Detective. Sarah knew they were lying, but she couldn't prove it yet. Mrs. Ashworth, I'll need to search Mr. Morrison's belongings. He may have identification that will help us understand why he was here. Of course, Margaret said. Whatever you need to find the truth. The irony of that statement wasn't lost on Sarah. James Morrison had been carrying a wallet with $43, a bus ticket from Millfield dated yesterday, and a key to a storage unit. But it was the letter in his jacket pocket that made Sarah's pulse quicken. The letter was addressed to Margaret Ashworth, written in Morrison's handwriting. It was brief but damning. The truth about that summer will come out. You've had 23 years to live with the lie. Now it's time for justice. Sarah found Margaret in the garden, ostensibly inspecting storm damage, but clearly trying to compose herself away from prying eyes. Mrs. Ashworth, I need to ask you again about James Morrison. Margaret didn't turn around. I told you, Detective. I don't know who he is. Then why did he write you this letter? Sarah held up the evidence bag containing the note. Margaret's shoulders sagged almost imperceptibly. When she finally turned around, her composed mask had slipped, revealing a frightened old woman beneath. You wouldn't understand, Margaret said quietly. Some secrets are meant to stay buried. Not when they lead to someone's death, Sarah replied. Mrs. Ashworth, what happened 23 years ago? James Morrison was convicted of killing a young woman named Lisa Parker. The case was closed decades ago. But he claimed he was innocent. Margaret's laugh was bitter. They all claim to be innocent, Detective. That doesn't make it true. Maybe. Not, but sometimes it does. Sarah studied the older woman's face. Mrs. Ashworth, I'm going to be very direct with you. James Morrison didn't die accidentally falling down your stairs. Someone killed him, and right now, you're my primary suspect. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She gripped the garden bench beside her for support. That's impossible, she whispered. I was asleep. I take medication, ... Medication that can be overcome by adrenaline, fear, or anger. Mrs. Ashworth, if James Morrison was blackmailing you, if he threatened to expose some secret from your past, it gives you motive. The fact that he died in your house gives you opportunity. All I need now is means. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, staring at the fallen oak tree that blocked the garden path. Detective Chun, do you believe in justice? Yes, ma'am, I do. Real justice? Not just the kind that comes from courts and judges, but the kind that balances the scales when the system fails? Sarah felt a chill despite the warming sun. Mrs. Ashworth, are you confessing to something? I'm asking a philosophical question. If someone committed a terrible crime and escaped punishment, and years later that injustice caused another tragedy, who bears the moral responsibility? A person who committed the original crime, Sarah said without hesitation. Margaret nodded slowly. Yes, I suppose you're right. She walked back toward the house, leaving Sarah standing alone in the garden, more confused than when the conversation started. But one thing was becoming clear: the death of James Morrison was connected to something that happened 23 years ago, and the Ashworth family was hiding something that was worth killing for Dot. Sarah returned to the house to find Daniel Ashworth in the study, speaking quietly on the phone. He ended the call when he saw her. Detective Chun, I hope my grandmother was helpful. Somewhat. Mr. Ashworth, where exactly did you go to college? The question seemed to surprise him. Harvard Law School. Why? And you practice law now? Corporate law, yes. I don't see how this is relevant. Sarah made a note. Your grandmother mentioned that you had a late business meeting last night. What time did it end? Around midnight. Maybe 12:30. And then you went to your apartment? Yes, I have a place in the city for nights when I work late. Sarah nodded. I'll need the address and the contact information for whoever you met with. For the first time, Daniel looked uncomfortable. Detective, surely you don't suspect me of anything. I wasn't even here when this Morrison fellow broke in. I'm just being thorough, Mr. Ashworth. Standard procedure. As Daniel wrote down the information, Sarah noticed his hands. They were clean now, but there was dirt under his fingernails, and a small cut on his knuckle that looked fresh. How did you hurt your hand? She asked. Daniel glanced down, seeming surprised by the injury. I'm not sure. Probably from helping clear some of the storm damage this morning. Another lie, Sarah thought. The housekeeper had said the family stayed inside until she arrived to unlock the doors. Sarah was beginning to form a picture of what had happened, but she needed more evidence. The storage unit key in Morrison's pocket was her next lead. Whatever secrets James Morrison had been holding, she suspected they were locked away in that unit, waiting to shed light on a 23-year-old crime and a very recent murder. She prepared to leave the mansion. Sarah took one more look at the grand staircase where James Morrison had died. The grandfather clock at the top of the stairs chimed 10 a.m., but she counted 3 chimes instead of the expected 2. Your clock seems to be malfunctioning, she mentioned to Daniel. Yes, he replied. It's been striking twice at every interval since we had some renovation work done. Grandmother's gotten used to it, but we keep meaning to have it repaired. Sarah nodded, but something about that detail bothered her. Like everything else in the Ashworth mansion, nothing was quite what it appeared to be. The grandfather clock held secrets of its own, she suspected. And before this case was closed, Sarah Chun intended to uncover every one of them. The Millbrook storage facility sat on the outskirts of town, a sprawling complex of corrugated metal buildings that housed the overflow of people's lives' Christmas. Decorations, old furniture, boxes of memories too precious to throw away, but too painful to keep close. Sarah arrived at Unit 247 with a warrant and a locksmith, though James Morrison's key made the latter unnecessary. The roll-up door squeaked as it rose, revealing a space approximately 10 by 12 feet. Unlike most storage units, this one was meticulously organized. File boxes lined the walls, each labeled with dates and case numbers. A small desk sat in the center with an ancient laptop computer and a banker's lamp that cast a circle of warm light in the dim space. "Looks like somebody's been using this as an office," Officer Martinez observed. Stepping carefully around the boxes, Sarah nodded, already reading the labels. The boxes spanned decades, but many were clustered around the years 1999 to 2002, the time period when James Morrison would have been arrested, tried, and convicted for the murder of Lisa Parker. She pulled down the box labeled Lisa Parker Evidence and set it on the desk. Inside were photocopies of police reports, witness statements, newspaper clippings, and photographs. But what caught Sarah's attention immediately was a manila folder marked Ashworth Connection. The folder contained a photograph of a young Margaret Ashworth, probably in her late 40s, standing beside a man Sarah didn't recognize. They were at some kind of social event, both dressed formally, both smiling at the camera. On the back of the photo, someone had written Margaret and Thomas Ashworth, Charity Gala, June 1999. June 1999. 2 months before Lisa Parker's murder. Sarah continued through the contents of the folder, finding newspaper articles about the Ashworth family's business dealings, copies of property records, and what appeared to be surveillance. Photos of the Ashworth mansion taken from various angles. At the bottom of the folder was a letter written in Morrison's handwriting, but never sent. Dear Margaret, I know you're reading this, which means something has happened to me. By now you probably think your secrets are safe, but they're not. I've spent 23 years piecing together the truth about that night, and I know what really happened to Lisa Parker. I know why she was at your estate. I know what she saw. And I know who really killed her to keep her quiet. You let me take the fall for a crime I didn't commit. And now it's time for the truth to come out. I've documented everything, the real evidence that was never presented at my trial, the witnesses who were never called, the connections that were never explored. It's all here waiting. You could have done the right thing 23 years ago, Margaret. Instead, you chose to protect your family at the expense of mine. My daughter thinks her father is a murderer. My wife died believing I was capable of killing an innocent young woman. You took everything from me, and now I'm taking everything from you. The truth has a way of surfacing, doesn't it? James Morrison. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. This wasn't just about blackmail or revenge. James Morrison had genuinely believed he was innocent, and he had spent more than 2 decades trying to prove it. She opened the box labeled Police Reports, Original Verses, filed, and found her suspicions confirmed. Morrison had somehow obtained copies of the original police reports alongside the versions that had been filed with the court. The differences were subtle, but significant witness statements had been edited, evidence had been omitted, and timelines had been adjusted. Someone had systematically altered the case against James Morrison to ensure his conviction. Martinez, Sarah called. I need you to contact the district attorney's office. We're going to need to review the original Lisa Parker murder case. The whole case? Detective, that was over 20 years ago. I know. But I'm starting to think we convicted the wrong man. As Sarah continued through Morrison's meticulous files, a picture began to emerge. Lisa Parker had been a young journalist working for the local newspaper, investigating a story about city council corruption. Her editor had assigned her to cover a charity gala hosted by the Ashworth family, but she had apparently been using the event as cover to meet with a source who had information about illegal land deals involving several prominent families. Morrison had been Lisa's boyfriend at the time, but according to his files, they had argued the night she died because she was becoming obsessed with the story and taking risks that made him uncomfortable. She had gone to the gala alone, and Morrison had spent the evening at a bar, drinking and feeling sorry for himself. Lisa's body had been found the next morning in Millbrook Park, strangled with what appeared to be a silk scarf. Morrison had been the obvious suspect, the boyfriend, who had argued with the victim hours before her death, who had no solid alibi, who had a history of minor scrapes with the law. But Morrison's investigation suggested a different timeline. According to a witness who had never been called to testify, Lisa had left the charity gala with someone else. Witness who described seeing her get into a dark sedan with another person around. 11:30 p.m. The charity gala had been held at the Ashworth mansion. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from the forensics team at the mansion. They had found something she needed to see immediately. 40 minutes later, Sarah stood in Margaret Ashworth's bedroom, staring at a dark stain on the Persian rug that forensics had revealed with luminol. The stain glowed blue-white under the UV light, unmistakably the pattern of blood that had been hastily cleaned but never fully removed. "How old is the stain?" Sarah asked the lead technician. "Hard to say exactly, but it's old. Years, maybe decades. The interesting thing is the pattern. It's consistent with someone bleeding from a shoulder or upper arm injury while sitting in that chair." He pointed to the velvet chair beside Margaret's bed. Sarah examined the chair more closely and found something the initial search had missed: a small hole in the upholstery that looked suspiciously like it had been made by a bullet. "Have you tested for gunshot residue on the chair?" "We're running tests now, but preliminary results suggest yes. Someone was shot in this room, probably while sitting in that chair." Sarah felt the pieces of the puzzle beginning to align. James Morrison had come to confront Margaret Ashworth about Lisa Parker's murder. There had been a struggle, perhaps, or maybe Margaret had simply panicked. She had shot Morrison, wounding him but not killing him immediately. Then what? Had Morrison bled out in the chair while Margaret decided what to do? Had someone else, Daniel, arrived and helped stage the scene to look like an accidental fall? The forensics team was still processing the bedroom when Sarah's phone rang. "Detective Chun? This is Dr. Patricia Williams at Millbrook General. I performed the autopsy on James Morrison." "What did you find, Doc?" "Cause of death was definitely the head trauma, but there's something unusual. Morrison had a significant amount of blood loss prior to the injury that killed him. I found what appears to be a bullet wound in his left shoulder, but no bullet. The wound was maybe 2 to 3 hours old when he died." Sarah closed her eyes, the timeline becoming clear. So he was shot first, then died later from the head trauma. Exactly. "Detective, this man was definitely murdered. Someone shot him. Let him bleed for a while, then finish the job by making it look like he fell down the stairs." After hanging up, Sarah found Daniel Ashworth in the mansion's library, reading a book as if nothing unusual was happening in his house. "Mr. Ashworth, I need to ask you some follow-up questions." Daniel looked up from his book, a legal thriller. Sarah noted and smiled politely. "Of course, Detective. You mentioned that you were in the city last night for a business meeting. I've been trying to verify that alibi, and I'm having some trouble." "Trouble?" "The colleague you said you met with has no record of any meeting last night. In fact, his assistant says he's been out of town all week." Daniel's composure slipped slightly. Perhaps there was some confusion about the date. These things happen. Perhaps you lied about where you were last night. Sarah leaned forward. "Mr. Ashworth, we found evidence that James Morrison was shot before he died. We also found blood evidence in her grandmother's bedroom that suggests someone was wounded in that room recently." "I don't understand what you're implying, Detective." "I'm implying that you and your grandmother killed James Morrison. I think he came here to confront her about something that happened 23 years ago. She shot him in self-defense or panic, and then you arrived and helped cover it up by staging his death to look like an accident." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his lawyer's mind clearly working through the implications. Finally, he spoke. "Detective Chun, I think you should speak with my grandmother. There are things about our family's history that are ... complicated. I intend to, but first, I want to hear your version of events." Daniel closed his book and set it aside. "Last night, I received a call from my grandmother around 12:45 a.m. She was hysterical, saying that a man had broken into the house and that she had shot him. I drove here immediately. Go on. When I arrived, I found James Morrison bleeding in my grandmother's bedroom chair. He was conscious, but weak. He told me he was there to make her pay for ruining his life, that he had evidence that would destroy our family. What did you do?" "I tried to call for an ambulance, but Morrison grabbed my arm. He said he didn't want medical attention. He wanted justice. He kept saying that my grandmother had let an innocent man go to prison for murder." Sarah waited, sensing that Daniel was approaching the crucial moment in his story. "Morrison was getting weaker, and I realized he was going to die from the blood loss. But before he did, he told me something that changed everything." "What?" Daniel looked directly at Sarah, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite identify. Guilt, fear, or maybe relief at finally telling the truth. "He told me who really killed Lisa Parker. And Detective, it wasn't him. It wasn't my grandmother either." The grandfather clock chimed in the distance 1 p.m. with its familiar double strike. Time striking twice, Sarah thought, once for the original crime and once for the consequences that had finally come home to roost. Who killed Lisa Parker, Mr. Ashworth? Daniel Ashworth took a deep breath and spoke the words that would unravel 23 years of carefully constructed lies. "My grandfather, Thomas Ashworth, and my grandmother has been protecting his memory ever since." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Thomas Ashworth had been dead for 15 years. She had seen his obituary in Morrison's files. If he was Lisa Parker's real killer, it meant that James Morrison had spent over 2 decades in prison for a crime he didn't commit, only to die seeking justice that could never be fully realized. "Tell me everything," Sarah said. Pulling out her recorder, Daniel leaned back in his chair, looking older than his 35 years. I was only 12 when Lisa Parker was murdered, but I remember that night clearly. There was a big party at the house, the charity gala. I was supposed to be asleep, but I snuck out to watch from the top of the stairs. He paused, gathering his thoughts. Lisa Parker was there as a reporter, but she wasn't mingling with the other guests. She kept checking her watch, looking around, like she was waiting for someone. Around 11 o'clock, my grandfather approached her. They talked quietly, and then they went into his study. Did you hear what they discussed? Not then. But later, after the guests had left, I heard them arguing. Lisa was accusing my grandfather of something, corruption, bribery. I couldn't understand all of it. But she was threatening to expose him, to write a story that would ruin the family. Sarah felt the pieces falling into place. What happened next? My grandfather was furious. I had never seen him like that before, completely out of control. Lisa tried to leave, but he grabbed her arm. There was a struggle, and then she was on the floor, not moving. Daniel's voice cracked. My grandmother found them in the study. Lisa was dead, and my grandfather was standing over her body with his hands around her throat. Grandmother sent me back to bed, but I heard them talking for hours, planning what to do. They decided to frame Morrison. Not immediately. At first, they thought they could make it look like an accident or a robbery gone wrong. But when the police started investigating Lisa's personal life, Morrison became the obvious suspect. My grandfather had contacts in the police department, people who owed him favors. It wasn't hard to ensure that certain evidence got overlooked, and certain witnesses weren't called. Sarah thought about Morrison's files, the discrepancies between the original reports and the filed versions. Your grandfather corrupted the investigation. Yes, and my grandmother went along with it because she thought she was protecting the family. She never considered the cost to Morrison or his family, but Morrison suspected the truth. He never stopped investigating. Even from prison, he was filing appeals, requesting evidence reviews, trying to prove his innocence. My grandmother was terrified that someday he would succeed. Daniel stood up and walked to the window overlooking the garden where the fallen oak trees still blocked the path. After my grandfather died, I thought the whole nightmare was over. But last night, Morrison showed up with proof of what really happened. He had photographs from the gala showing Lisa leaving the main party area with my grandfather. He had witness statements from people who had seen them together, but were never asked to testify. He had documents proving that my grandfather had been taking bribes from developers in exchange for favorable city council votes. The same story Lisa had been investigating. Why didn't your grandmother just tell the truth then? Your grandfather was dead. There was nothing left to protect. Daniel turned back to Sarah, his face grim, because there was still something to protect. Me. The admission hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Sarah felt her stomach drop as she realized what Daniel was about to confess. You were involved, not in the original murder, but in the cover-up, yes. When I turned 18, my grandmother told me the whole truth about what had happened. She was afraid that someday Morrison would prove his innocence and come after the family for revenge. She wanted me to be prepared. Daniel sat back down, his hands trembling slightly. Over the years, whenever Morrison got close to proving something, I would intervene. I used my legal training to file motions that would delay his appeals, to challenge evidence requests, to make sure his case never got the attention it deserved. I had contacts in the prosecutor's office who would bury his requests in paperwork or find technicalities to dismiss them. Sarah stared at him in disgust. You actively work to keep an innocent man in prison. I was protecting my family's legacy, my grandmother's reputation, my own future. If the truth had come out, it would have destroyed everything we had built. Daniel's voice was defensive but hollow. I told myself that Morrison was already in prison, that bringing my grandfather's crimes to light wouldn't change that. I convinced myself that it was better to leave the past buried. Until last night. Until last night, Daniel nodded. Morrison had finally gathered enough evidence to force a new trial. He had found witnesses who remembered seeing Lisa leave with my grandfather. He had documentation of the bribes, the corruption, everything. When he confronted my grandmother, he told her that the truth was coming out whether she cooperated or not. Sarah leaned forward, so she shot him. In panic, yes. Morrison was shouting, threatening to destroy everything. My grandmother is old, detective. She's not thinking clearly anymore. When she saw Morrison in her room in the middle of the night, 23 years of guilt and fear took over. And then you arrived. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Morrison was dying when I got there. The gunshot wound was serious, but not immediately fatal. He could have survived if I had called for help right away. The confession Sarah had been waiting for was finally coming. But you didn't call for help. No, I sat with him instead. I listened. As he told me about his daughter, who had grown up believing her father was a murderer. About his wife, who had died alone while he served time for a crime he didn't commit. About 23 years of his life that had been stolen because my family was too cowardly to face the consequences of my grandfather's actions. Daniel's voice broke completely now. Morrison looked me in the eye as he was dying and said, "You could have stopped this. You could have set me free years ago. But you chose to keep me caged like an animal. You're just as guilty as the rest of them." Sarah felt sick. "So you let him die." I made a choice. I could call for help and watch my grandmother spend her final years in prison for shooting an intruder. Or I could let nature take its course and preserve what was left of our family. That wasn't your choice to make, wasn't it? Daniel's eyes flashed with anger. Morrison was going to destroy us all anyway. His evidence was going to come out regardless. At least this way, my grandmother wouldn't have to face a murder trial. Sarah stood up abruptly. "Mr. Ashworth, you're under arrest for the murder of James Morrison." "Detective, wait." Daniel held up his hand. "There's something else you need to know." Against her better judgment, Sarah paused. "Morrison's evidence, all those files in the storage unit, they don't just implicate my grandfather in Lisa Parker's murder. They prove that the corruption went much deeper. City council members, police officials, prosecutors, all of them were involved in covering up various crimes over the years." Daniel smiled grimly. "If you pursue this case, detective, you're going to uncover a conspiracy that reaches into every level of Millbrook's government. Are you prepared for that? Are you ready to destroy dozens of careers and reputations for the sake of one dead blackmailer?" Sarah felt a moment of doubt. She thought about her own career, her pension, the political pressure that would come down on her if she opened this can of worms. Then she thought about James Morrison, dying alone in this mansion, seeking justice that had been denied to him for over 2 decades. "Yes," she said simply. "I am." Before Daniel could respond, they heard Margaret Ashworth's voice from the doorway. "No, you're not." Sarah turned to see the elderly woman standing in the entrance to the library, no longer the frail, frightened person she had appeared to be that morning. Margaret's eyes were cold and calculating, and in her hand was the same revolver she had used to shoot Morrison. "Grandmother, put the gun down," Daniel said, standing slowly. "Sit down, Daniel." Margaret's voice was steady now, all traces of confusion gone. "Detective Chun, I'm afraid you've learned more than is good for your health." Sarah's hand moved instinctively toward her service weapon, but Margaret was already aiming at her center mass. "I wouldn't, Detective. I may be old, but I'm still an excellent shot. My late husband made sure I knew how to protect myself and my family. Mrs. Ashworth, this won't solve anything. Too many people know the truth now, do they? You haven't filed your report yet. Officer Martinez thinks this is a simple case of a burglar falling down the stairs. The only evidence connecting us to Morrison's real death is in that storage unit, and that can be dealt with." Sarah realized with growing horror that Margaret Ashworth was far more dangerous than she had initially believed. The confused, frightened old woman had been an act designed to throw her off the scent. "You planned this from the beginning," Sarah said. "When Morrison contacted you, you knew he would come here eventually. You were ready for him." Margaret smiled coldly. "Detective, I've been planning for this day for 23 years. Did you really think I would let some ex-convict destroy everything I've worked to protect?" The grandfather clock chimed again 2 p.m. with its distinctive double strike. Margaret glanced toward the sound, and in that moment of distraction, Sarah made her move. She dove sideways behind the heavy oak desk as Margaret's gun fired, the bullet splintering the wood inches from her head. Daniel shouted something, but Sarah couldn't hear him over the ringing in her ears. "Mrs. Ashworth, put the weapon down," Sarah called out, drawing her own gun. "This ends now." "No, Detective," came Margaret's voice, eerily calm. "This is where it begins." Sarah heard footsteps moving toward the door and realized Margaret was trying to escape. She peered around the edge of the desk and saw the older woman backing toward the hallway, the gun still trained on the library. "Daniel, call 911, Sarah ordered, but when she looked toward where Daniel had been standing, the chair was empty. A moment later, she heard the front door slam shut. Both Ashworths were running. Sarah radioed for backup as she pursued them through the mansion and out into the afternoon sunlight. Margaret was moving surprisingly quickly for her age, heading toward the carriage house where several cars were parked. Daniel was already starting one of them, a black BMW sedan. "Stop! Police!" Sarah shouted, but Margaret fired another shot that sent Sarah diving behind a stone planter. By the time Sarah recovered, the BMW was racing down the circular drive toward the main road, Margaret in the passenger seat beside her grandson. Sarah ran to her own car and gave chase, calling in their description and direction of travel. But as she reached the main road, she realized she had lost them in the maze of country lanes that surrounded the Ashworth estate. The grandfather clock in the mansion continued to chime behind her, its broken mechanism marking time with double strikes that echoed across the empty grounds. Time had struck twice for the Ashworth family, and now they were running from both the past and the present, carrying their deadly secrets with them into an uncertain future. But Sarah Chun was determined that this time, justice would not be denied. The hunt was just beginning. The manhunt for Margaret and Daniel Ashworth lasted 18 hours. Sarah coordinated with state police, set up roadblocks, and monitored airports and train stations. But the Ashworths seemed to have vanished into thin air, along with the black BMW and whatever resources they had managed to gather before fleeing. It was Officer Martinez who finally spotted the car at 8:15 a.m. the following morning, abandoned in the parking lot of St. Mary's Cemetery on the outskirts of Millbrook. Sarah arrived to find the vehicle empty, except for 2 items left deliberately. On the dashboard, a manila envelope and an old brass key. The envelope contained a handwritten confession signed by Margaret Ashworth. In it, she admitted to shooting James Morrison, but claimed it was in self-defense when he broke into her home and threatened her life. She made no mention of the original Lisa Parker murder or her husband's involvement in the cover-up. The brass key, Sarah realized, belonged to the Ashworth family mausoleum that stood on a hill at the far end of the cemetery. They wouldn't, Martinez muttered as they approached the imposing marble structure, but they would, and they had. Sarah found Margaret and Daniel Ashworth inside the mausoleum, seated on the stone bench before Thomas Ashworth's tomb. They had taken their own lives with the same revolver Margaret had used to kill Morrison, first Daniel, then Margaret. A final note, pinned to Margaret's coat, contained only 4 words: "The truth dies here." But Margaret Ashworth had miscalculated. The truth didn't die with them. If anything, their dramatic suicide only confirmed everything James Morrison had claimed about the Ashworth family's guilt, and Morrison's meticulous documentation in the storage unit provided a roadmap for investigators to uncover the full extent of the corruption that had plagued Millbrook for decades. Sarah spent the next 6 months working with state and federal authorities to unravel the conspiracy that Morrison had exposed. The investigation revealed that Thomas Ashworth had been at the center of a web of corruption involving at least 15 city officials, 3 police officers, and 2 prosecutors. They had systematically suppressed evidence, manipulated investigations, and ensured that certain cases never came to trial. Lisa Parker's murder had been just the beginning. Over the years, the conspiracy had covered up everything from insurance, fraud to embezzlement to domestic violence cases involving prominent families. James Morrison's wrongful conviction had been just one casualty in a system designed to protect the wealthy and powerful. At the expense of justice, the ripple effects were enormous. Mayor Patricia Hendricks resigned in disgrace when her connection to Thomas Ashworth's bribes was revealed. Police Chief Robert Manning was arrested for evidence tampering. The district attorney's office had to review hundreds of cases from the past 3 decades, looking for other instances where justice had been perverted. But perhaps most importantly, James Morrison was officially exonerated. His daughter, Jennifer Morrison Walsh, filed a multi-million-dollar wrongful conviction lawsuit against the city. More significantly, she established the James Morrison Foundation for Criminal Justice Reform, dedicated to helping other wrongfully convicted individuals prove their innocence. Sarah attended the foundation's first fundraising dinner, where Jennifer Morrison Walsh spoke about her father's long struggle to clear his name. "My father spent 23 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit," Jennifer said, her voice strong despite the tears in her eyes. But he never stopped fighting for the truth. Even when the system failed him, even when powerful people conspired to keep him silent, he kept gathering evidence, kept filing appeals, kept believing that justice would eventually prevail. She paused, looking out at the audience of lawyers, activists, and journalists who had come to support the cause. My father died seeking that justice, but his death wasn't meaningless. The evidence he gathered, the corruption he exposed, the truth he fought for, all of that will help other innocent people who find themselves trapped by a system that values power over justice. After the dinner, Jennifer approached Sarah privately. "Detective Chun, I wanted to thank you. You could have let this case die with the Ashworths. You could have filed a report saying that Morrison was a burglar who fell down the stairs, and no one would have questioned it." Sarah shook her head. "Your father deserved better. He deserved the truth. Yes, he did. But more than that, he deserved to live to see his name cleared, to see the people who wronged him face justice." Jennifer's voice hardened. "The Ashworths took the easy way out. They killed themselves rather than face the consequences of their actions. Just like they let my father die rather than admit their guilt." Sarah understood Jennifer's anger, but she also knew that in some ways the Ashworths had faced the ultimate justice. They had died with their world collapsing around them, their reputation in ruins, their carefully constructed lies finally exposed. 3 months after the case was closed, Sarah received a package with no return address. Inside was an antique clock, not a grandfather clock like the one in the Ashworth mansion, but a smaller mantel clock with a brass nameplate reading James Morrison, 1954 to 2022. With the clock was a note from Jennifer. "My father kept this clock in his cell for 23 years. It never kept proper time. The mechanism was damaged, and it always struck twice at every hour. Dad used to joke that it was broken like the justice system, but he kept it anyway as a reminder that time would eventually heal all wounds and reveal all truths." Sarah placed the clock on her desk at the police station, where it continues to chime its double strikes every hour. Her colleagues think it's broken, but Sarah knows better. Some clocks strike twice because they're damaged. Others strike twice because they're telling a deeper truth about time itself, that every moment carries the weight of both past and future, that every choice echoes forward and backward through the years. The Morrison clock reminds her daily that justice delayed is not justice denied, as long as someone is willing to keep fighting for the truth. James Morrison spent 23 years seeking justice for a crime he didn't commit. Margaret Ashworth spent 23 years living with the guilt of letting an innocent man pay for her husband's crime. Daniel Ashworth spent 17 years actively working to suppress the truth. In the end, time struck twice for all of them. Once when the original sin was committed, and once when the consequences finally came due. The grandfather clock in the Ashworth mansion was sold at auction, along with the rest of the estate's contents. Sarah doesn't know who bought it, or whether they've had its mechanism repaired. She hopes they haven't. Some clocks should strike twice, as a reminder that time never forgets. And neither should we. The James Morrison case officially closed on a Tuesday morning in March. Sarah filed her final report, testifying that James Morrison had been murdered by Margaret Ashworth, who subsequently took her own life, along with her grandson Daniel, rather than face justice for their crimes. But the real case, the search for truth and justice that James Morrison had begun in his prison cell 23 years earlier, that case was finally closed too. Justice had struck twice, echoing across the decades like the chimes of a broken clock, and James Morrison could finally rest in peace, his name cleared and his fight vindicated. The truth had indeed surfaced, just as he always believed it would. In Millbrook, the old families still live in their grand houses, but they no longer control the levers of power as they once did. The corruption that Thomas Ashworth had built and his family had maintained for decades was finally exposed, dismantled, and replaced with systems designed to serve justice rather than privilege. Sarah Chun was promoted to lieutenant 6 months after the case closed. She still keeps James Morrison's broken clock on her desk, and every time it strikes twice, she remembers that time may be the ultimate judge, but it needs human agents to carry out its verdicts. The clock struck twice, and justice was finally served. But in Millbrook, as in every small town with dark secrets, Sarah knows that other clocks are ticking, other truths are waiting to surface, and other silent witnesses are preparing to speak. She'll be ready when they do. The end.